The telegram arrived at the mission house on a Tuesday morning in January 1934, and the woman who read it did not weep. She had learned by then that there was no time for weeping when there was still work left to do. But let us begin at the beginning, because before Gladys Aylward became the woman they called Ai-weh-teh, the Virtuous One, before she walked 94 children across the mountains of Shanxi Province in the dead of winter, with Japanese bombs falling behind her, before she stood in a prison courtyard and commanded a riot to stop with nothing but her voice and her God, before all of that, she was a parlour maid from Edmonton, London, who had been told quite plainly that she was not good enough. The year was 1929. Gladys was 27 years old. She had applied to the China Inland Mission. She had studied, prepared, prayed. She had surrendered everything she thought she was in order to become what God was asking her to be. And at the end of her course of study, the examiners sat down with her and gave their verdict. She was, they said, too old to learn Chinese. Her academic record was insufficient. She lacked the theological foundation required. The mission could not in good conscience send her to the field. She was rejected, dismissed, sent home. Most people at this point would have taken the verdict as final. Most people would have concluded that they had misread the call. But Gladys Aylward was not most people, and the God who had spoken to her in a parlour in Edmonton was not a God who changed his mind because a committee had doubts. She went back to scrubbing floors, and while she scrubbed, she saved. Every coin she did not spend on food. Every shilling set aside from her wages as a domestic servant. She was going to China on her own if she had to buy the ticket herself, and that is precisely what she intended to do. Here is what nobody tells you about Gladys Aylward. The miracle of Shanxi did not begin with a prison riot or a mountain crossing. It began in a rented room in Swansea, Wales, with a woman bent over a map of the Trans-Siberian Railway, calculating, in the lamplight, whether she had enough money for the cheapest possible route to the other side of the world. She did not. She had almost enough. She kept saving. In October 1932, Gladys Aylward boarded a train at Liverpool Street Station in London with a suitcase, a bedroll, £2.09, and a ticket to Tientsin, China. She was traveling alone through Europe across Russia, at that moment on the edge of war with China, and into Manchuria, across terrain that no sane person was using for civilian travel. Mission boards would not send her. No organization was backing her. No committee had approved the plan. She had a one-way ticket and the address of a 73-year-old Scottish woman named Jeannie Lawson, who had written to say she needed a helper in a small inn she was running in the interior of Shanxi Province. That was all. The train journey took her through Warsaw, through Moscow, through Chita. She was stopped at the Russian-Manchurian border by soldiers who spoke no English. Her luggage was searched. She was held. The train continued without her. She spent a night in Chita in winter, alone, without the language, without connections, dependent entirely on a God she had staked her life on in a decision that, by every rational measure, looked like madness. She made it to Tientsin. She made it to Shanxi. She made it, by mule and by foot, up into the mountains to the small market town of Yangcheng, where Jeannie Lawson was waiting. The inn they ran together was called the Inn of 8 Happinesses. They opened it to muleteers, the men who drove mule trains through the mountain passes, offering them a place to sleep, food, and, when they had rested enough to listen, stories. Gladys had spent the weeks of her journey learning Mandarin from the woman she would come to call Mrs. Lawson, and now she stood at the gate of the inn each evening and shouted at passing mule trains in broken, ferocious Mandarin to come in and eat. The muleteers thought she was extraordinary. Small, dark-haired, English, absolutely fearless, with a laugh that carried across the courtyard. They came in. They ate. They heard the stories. And something began to stir in the mountains of Shanxi that no mission board committee had predicted, and no examinership had sanctioned. But here is what you must understand about the price Gladys paid before any of it. She arrived in China with almost nothing. She had given up her professional prospects in England. She had no salary, no pension, no mission society standing behind her. When Mrs. Lawson died in 1934, a fall in the courtyard, a fever, a death that came too quickly, Gladys was left alone in a foreign country, with an inn to run, a language she was still learning, and a faith that had not yet been tested to its absolute limit. She kept the inn open. And then the Mandarin of Yangcheng came to her with a proposition. The imperial government had declared that foot binding, the practice of breaking and binding the feet of young girls, was illegal. But the edict was not being obeyed. The Mandarin needed inspectors to travel from village to village enforcing the law, and he could not send men into the inner rooms of family homes. He needed a woman. Specifically, he needed a woman with natural feet who could demonstrate that it was possible to walk, to work, to live fully with unbound feet. He needed Gladys. She accepted. She became a foot inspector for the Chinese government, traveling by mule through villages she had never visited, entering homes, speaking to mothers and daughters in the growing fluency of a language that had once been judged beyond her capacity. And as she traveled, she listened. She heard the stories of children, the orphaned, the abandoned, the ones left on roadsides because their families could not feed them. She began bringing them home, one at a time at first. A child she found in a market, a girl who had been sold, a boy left beside a road in winter. She brought them to the Inn of 8 Happinesses, and she fed them and she kept them, and she did not ask who was going to pay for it, because she had already learned that that was not the right question. By 1938, she had adopted over 100 children. By 1938, Japan had invaded China, and the mountains of Shanxi were no longer remote enough to be safe. What happened next is the part of Gladys Aylward's story that people remember, the part that was made into a film, the part that gets told in churches and schools and history books. But the accounts often leave out the weight of it, the sheer, grinding, physical weight of what she did. In the spring of 1938, Japanese forces advanced on Yangcheng. Gladys had already been working as an intelligence operative for the Chinese Nationalist Army, passing information through the mountains about Japanese troop movements, a fact that had put a price on her head. When the bombs began falling on Yangcheng, she gathered her children. At that point, she had approximately 100 of them, ranging in age from 4 to 16. The nearest safe ground was across the Yellow River and beyond the mountains, a journey of over 100 miles on foot, through terrain that was actively being bombed and strafed. In the early weeks of spring, when the mountain passes were still cold, she was 37 years old. She had no military escort. She had no supplies to speak of. She had malaria, which had already begun to take hold of her. She gathered the children, and she walked. 12 days through the mountains. 12 days of rationed food, of children crying, of the older ones carrying the younger ones when their legs gave out, of Gladys herself moving from the front to the back of the column and back to the front again, counting, always counting, making sure none were lost. There were moments in the mountain passes when she did not know, from one step to the next, whether she had the strength to continue. There were nights when the children slept in caves, and Gladys lay awake listening to the sound of distant artillery and praying the kind of prayer that does not use words, the kind that is simply a person flattened to the floor of themselves, with nothing left but the God they have not stopped believing in. She got them to the Yellow River. The river was wide. They had no way to cross. There were no boats at that section of the river. The war had disrupted all normal transport. The children sat on the bank and waited, and the oldest ones looked at Gladys. And Gladys stood at the edge of the water and did something that she later described, quietly, without drama, as simply asking God to sort it out. A Nationalist Army patrol found them. The soldiers ferried the children across in boats over the course of a day, all of them, everyone. On the other side of the river, they still had to cross the mountains on foot to reach the orphanage at Fufeng. Days more of walking. Gladys, by this point, was seriously ill. She was running a fever from the malaria. She had a head wound from a bullet that had grazed her during one of the earlier stretches of the journey. She could barely stand, but she kept moving because the children needed someone to keep moving. When they arrived at Fufeng, Gladys collapsed. She did not wake for days. When she did wake, she was told that all 100 children had arrived. Not one had been lost. She wept then, finally. She had not let herself weep on the mountains, but even now, even in recovery, the story is not simple, because Gladys Aylward survived and recovered and continued, and the world did not immediately recognize what she had done. She returned to work, continued working with orphans, continued her ministry in the interior of China. And it was not until 1957, when a journalist named Alan Burgess published a book called The Small Woman, that the broader world began to understand what had happened in those mountains in 1938. The book led to the film The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, which starred Ingrid Bergman, a casting choice that baffled Gladys, who was a small dark-haired Londoner, and who reportedly said, upon seeing the promotional materials, that Ingrid Bergman was far too tall. She said it without bitterness. That was characteristic, because here is what the film and the book, and even the history accounts tend to miss about Gladys Aylward. She was funny. Not in a performance way, not in a way designed to make people like her. She simply had a direct, dry, completely unpretentious sense of the absurdity of things, including herself. She was, by all accounts of people who knew her, deeply ordinary in the way that people who are genuinely filled with something extraordinary tend to be ordinary. She did not carry herself like a hero. She carried herself like a woman who had work to do and was going to go and do it. She returned to England in 1949, after the Communist Revolution in China made her continued ministry there impossible. She found England strange, changed, cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. She gave talks in churches. She was interviewed. People who heard her were astonished by the smallness of her, the plainness of her, the complete absence of any of the grand manner they expected from someone who had done what she had done. She was astonished that they were astonished. In 1957, she returned to Asia, this time to Taiwan, where she established an orphanage and continued her work with children until the end of her life. She was given Taiwanese citizenship. She was loved there, genuinely loved in the way that you love someone who has been present for the most difficult moments of your life and has not left. She died in Taiwan on January 3, 1970, of pneumonia. She was 67 years old. The orphanage she had built was full of children. The mission board that rejected her in 1929 had told her she was not good enough to learn Chinese. By the time she died, she had spoken Mandarin fluently for nearly 4 decades. She had been given an official Chinese name, Ai-weh-teh, by the people of Yangcheng, because they could not imagine her as anything other than one of them. She had walked 100 children across mountains under fire. She had worked herself, in that crossing, to the edge of what a human body can physically sustain, and she had sustained it because she did not believe the edge was where God stopped. She never wrote a memoir. She was not particularly interested in her own story. What interested her was the work, the next child, the next need, the next stretch of road that had to be walked. This is the thing about Gladys Aylward that is hardest to communicate and most important to understand. She was not extraordinary because she was brave in a grand, decisive, single moment. She was extraordinary because she was faithful in 10,000 small ones, because she saved her pennies in a rented room in Swansea when no one was watching, because she kept the inn open alone after Mrs. Lawson died, with no salary and no support, and no guarantee, because she counted the children in the mountain passes in the dark and made sure, every single time, that every single one was still there. The mission board asked whether she was capable of the big things, and they concluded she was not. God asked whether she was willing to be faithful in the small things, and she said yes every morning for 40 years. That is the difference between what institutions can see and what God can see. Before she left for China in 1932, Gladys had a conversation with her mother that her mother later recounted to people who asked about her daughter. Gladys had said, simply, that she knew she was supposed to go, that she had prayed about it for years, that she did not know how it would work. She genuinely did not know how she was going to get there, how she was going to live, how she was going to do any of it, but she knew she was supposed to go. Her mother had asked what would happen if it all went wrong. Gladys had said that she supposed God would sort it out. She said it without irony, without bravado. She meant it exactly as literally as it sounded. And looking at what followed, the mule trains and the orphans and the mountain crossing and the 100 children standing on the far side of the Yellow River, it is difficult to argue with her. There is a version of faith that waits for permission, that waits for the committee to approve, for the board to certify, for the institution to open the door. That version of faith is understandable. It is careful. It wants to get things right. And then there is the version of faith that Gladys Aylward practiced, the kind that buys the ticket, when it doesn't quite have enough money, that boards the train anyway, that stands at the border in winter in a country where it doesn't speak the language, and prays the kind of prayer that has no words, just a person and their God and whatever road comes next. She was not reckless. She was not impulsive. She was a woman who had spent years saving and preparing and praying before she ever set foot on that train. The difference between her faith and recklessness was not the presence of boldness. It was the presence of years of faithfulness before the bold thing was ever asked of her. You cannot walk 100 children across a mountain range on nothing. You walk them across on everything you have been building, quietly, in all the small rooms of your life where no one is watching. Gladys Aylward built that for 40 years, and the children made it to the other side. What price are you willing to pay? Not the dramatic price, the mountain crossing, the moment of decision, the crisis that makes you a hero. Those moments come once. The price that matters is the one paid every morning in the ordinary rooms of your life, when no one is watching and the work is plain and there is no guarantee of anything except the God you have chosen to trust. That is where Gladys Aylward became who she was. Not on the mountain, in the parlor, at the mop, with the pennies. Comment below if this story has stirred something in you, and if you want to know about the women and men who walked alongside Gladys in the interior of China, the ones who saw what she was becoming before the world did. Subscribe to Circle of Voices, because those stories are coming, and they will not leave you unchanged.